Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Martin Caballero. I'm the managing editor at BevNET.com. I'm here at my home office just outside Boston, and we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the coronavirus outbreak and how it's affecting the food and beverage industry. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about employee and resource allocation. What are the things you should be thinking about during this crisis? And we're happy to be joined by a good friend of BevNet and Nosh, Bob Burke. He's the principal at Natural Products Consulting. Bob, thanks so much for joining us. And just first of all, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. So happy to be here. Like most of the world, I'm sort of hunkered down, but everyone's healthy and everybody's doing well, and trying to get out for a little fresh air from time to time. But otherwise, doing our best to do our part to keep this from spreading.
That's good to hear. And again, it's great to have you here to speak about this topic. In terms of employee and resource allocation, this is an unprecedented crisis that companies have not experienced before. How do you even begin to prioritize at this time?
Well, to begin with, in uncertain and turbulent times, there really isn't much of a playbook, right? So all of us need to be guided by our principles and values, be true to your mission and purpose, and keep an eye on longer term objectives. And really, start by taking care of yourself. And I don't mean being selfish, but make sure you're getting enough sleep, exercise, fresh air, eating well, so you can be there for your team. And when it comes to your team, you really need to be tuned in on how they're doing, level of anxiety, personal health, any personal kid or aging parent issues that's going on in their life. So you can really have a good understanding of what they're going through. And if there's ever a time to over communicate and overshare, it's now, right? So keeping people informed on what's going on in the business, ensure that they have what they need to work from home, and that you're fostering good communication within the company, whether it's small groups or you as a leader checking in with them one-on-one. And then probably needless to say, as a leader, you have to have absolute laser focus on cash flow, weekly, if not daily. If you have a line of credit, hopefully you've drawn it down by now. And then you're doing everything you can to stretch your runway by trimming whatever fixed you can, retainers, trade programs, et cetera, to make your cash go.
Well, one of the biggest restrictions right now because of the crisis is on movement and transportation. A lot of businesses are closed, obviously. So how can you effectively deploy your sales staff and resources during this time when they're not able to go out into the field?
Well, I mean, one of the sort of obvious ways that they can really help is by being on top of what's going on in the numbers, so they can help inform the rest of the team in terms of demand planning, supply chain considerations. And in some cases, it might mean allocating scarce product to customers. They can also focus some time on smaller accounts that may not always get a lot of attention, and see if they might need direct shipments if that's possible. Sometimes distributors are capping what's going to each customer, so you might be able to pitch in and help there. And then a lot of folks are working on the back half of the year, so that when things start to subside, you can sort of hit the ground running with promotional programs and other things in the work, so you're not starting from a dead stop. And then, you might take some time and go back over leads and priorities from the last, say, 12 or 24 months that might not have been on the front burner, but now you have more time for that.
Bob, we've talked a lot before at the BevNet and Nosh events previously about the importance of setting up your team, constantly evaluating and setting goals for them. How does this extraordinary kind of situation play into that? How should you evaluate employee performance during this time? And how do you sort of approach the possibility of potentially making difficult staff cuts?
Sure. Well, I would start with, if you really believe you're going to come through this, then the right thing to do is try to keep everyone on the payroll. If cash is tight, you might see about asking people to maybe take a 10 or 20% haircut before resorting to layoffs. But if you think that's going to put the company at risk, then you're going to be forced to make some hard choices. And clearly, if someone's not performing, what might have been put off in the past becomes a much easier and more urgent decision in these times. When it comes to evaluating performance, ideally, everybody has a really good understanding of what's expected of them in terms of results, and you have some kind of a formal review process. You've got the proper reward pay, and I'm making the distinction between reward pay versus incentives because this should be about results, and that everybody kind of knows where they stand throughout the year. So giving feedback on that on a regular basis is very important.
Another thing that we talked about at past events is the importance of your relationship with brokers. Now, again, during this time of extraordinary kind of crisis and difficult situation for everyone involved, how should you be thinking about those relationships and how can you maximize those partnerships during this time?
Well, brokers, just like contract salespeople, just like your own employees, should all be working against a set of objectives and having some kind of a review process in place so they know where they stand. But right now, brokers can really be a huge help in terms of consolidating your understanding about what's going on with specific retailers and distributors, about who's still doing category reviews, resets, running promotions, and really having sort of a finger on the pulse in terms of how much of the surge in demand is panic buying and how much is the dramatic increase in terms of at-home consumption because of away from home being shut down so much. And so when you can, I think it's great to schedule Zoom calls with them. Certainly, they have more time in their hands. They should be very available and understand what's going on in their market, make sure they're clear on priorities. And again, what are going to be the first next steps when things start approaching getting back to normal? And, I go into this with the attitude that most brokers are as committed as ever to being a good partner. They want to pitch in and help. If because of cash flow you think you're going to be slow in paying them, preempt that conversation, be upfront with them. And I'm sure most of them will understand because we're all going through this together. And you can also, again, get proactive on promotion planning and new item presentations, et cetera, that you might expect on the second half of the year so that, again, you're not starting from a dead stop.
Now, in terms of e-commerce, that's a channel that's experiencing a big surge in demand right now and a rich area for growth for a lot of small brands. How would you advise brands to sort of approach that space during this time in terms of allocating resources and staff? I mean, if you don't have a robust platform and e-commerce operation up already, is now the time to sort of jump in full force?
Absolutely. Again, the world is changing by the week, not just because of this pandemic. The whole move towards omni-channel has been going on for a while. Certainly, if you're a shelf-stable product, e-commerce is a little easier, but certainly a lot of refrigerated and frozen products are doing well. And, we're moving towards this new normal. And so many of the practices that we're adapting to in the short term are going to be sticking, whether it's virtual meetings, working from home, home delivery, and certainly e-commerce is going to be an even bigger part of all of our lives. And, not to be pessimistic, but this is not going to be ending at Easter, and things will not be springing back 100% as if this never happened. So many of the things that we've been sort of forced into in the short term are going to be part of our lives going forward. And, I think this has the potential of going on for months, hopefully not too many, but definitely months, not weeks. And a lot of the behavioral changes we're making are going to be sticking.
And just following up on that, in terms of consumer behavior, how can we expect a possible recession and economic hardship to affect consumer behavior? And how should companies be thinking about that in terms of deploying their resources and staff at the moment?
Well, again, one of the sort of silver linings, if you want to look at it that way, is especially emerging companies are getting unprecedented trial, right? Just with, if you think of the big picture, the U.S. food market is like $1 trillion, which is hard to wrap our heads around. Aside from the relief package that just got approved, that's supposed to be $2 trillion. But if you think of $1 trillion, and historically half of it has been food consumed, and this is food, beverage, things like that, consumed at home. The other half, plus or minus a percent, has been away from home. And this might be swinging in the short term to something like 75-25 or 80-20, less whatever is happening in terms of takeout, home delivery and drive-through, et cetera. So grocery sales are through the roof, e-com. And so a lot of these brands, even if they were perhaps overlooked, might be one of the few things on the shelf at the time. And so they're getting that extra attention and certainly trial. So whatever they can do to capitalize on that is going to be hugely important. Now, when we had the last recession, 2008, the global financial crisis, the categories that were the most inelastic, which means, did not change much in terms of demand, given the hardship that was going on, were things that were, product for kids and pets, organic products that were sort of closer to the farm, things like produce, fluid milk, and the things that were a little more elastic were, more, discretionary type products, so organic cookies and things like that, and maybe personal care. So some of those took a little bit of a bigger hit. Bulk foods were very big, both in terms of the sustainability issues, but also economy.
Hiring and employment is another thing that's obviously been in the news a lot lately, how it's been affected by this crisis. So how should companies be thinking about bringing on new staff at the moment? And how do you sort of balance the short-term versus long-term priorities when you're thinking about adding new staff?
So not to give you a non-answer, but everything depends on your resources and your specific needs. But plenty of the companies I'm involved with are still hiring, and there happen to be some very good people out there who have been displaced either because of maybe a recent exit or something completely separate from what's going on in the economy right this moment. So companies are continuing to hire where they have needs. Obviously, you want to be extremely selective. If someone's out of work, you may see if they're open to doing this on something of a trial basis, make sure it's a good fit for both of you. Whereas before, it was a very tight labor market, and you really had to make a commitment and put an attractive package together to get someone to jump if they were in a good situation.
Just continuing for a second on building teams and company culture, we're all adapting to this new situation where working remotely is the new normal, at least for now. How do you continue to keep that company culture strong? How do you keep morale up with your staff? And how do you keep the work flowing and efficient during this time as we all adapt?
Yeah, that's a great question, Marty. As I mentioned earlier, you can't over communicate. So absolutely let everybody know what's going on in the business. Be checking in with them on a regular basis. So important to set clear expectations on what great results look like and show trust. My original premise is people want to do a good job. They want to show up. They want to deliver. And so show that you trust them to do that and have some fun. And it's not all about alcohol, but virtual happy hour has entered the zeitgeist. Quarantini is trending. And another fun thing I heard was one company taking turns doing story hour for all their respective kids who are at home. So think about things like that you can really, foster that sense of community when everybody is physically separate.
And Bob, it's still early. This is obviously still unfolding. But as we begin to think a little bit about the long-term impacts of this crisis, how is this going to inform how companies prepare for potential disruptions in the future?
Well, it's like the old adage of when the water recedes, it exposes the rocks. And companies need to rapidly adapt to survive and thrive in this new reality, but definitely with a much greater sense of urgency to act, a bias towards action. And as much as we're all focused on today and the here and now, which we have to be, got to keep one eye on long-term strategic objectives. And as much as you can, and especially with input from your team, outside advisors, investors, and others, try to start to develop a picture of what you think the world is going to look like when this begins to pass, and start to put steps in place in terms of how you're going to adapt and capitalize on the new opportunities.
Well, that's great advice, great insight, and it was great speaking with you, Bob. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks for joining us here on BevNet and Nosh, and stay safe. We'll talk to you soon, okay?
My pleasure, and so happy to be part of this. Thanks.
Hey, thanks for watching. Hit subscribe and ding that bell.